G'day, how you doing? So I want to begin this talk with a bit of a warning and a bit of a challenge. So the warning is that I'm a philosopher. So I'm pretty abstract. I don't deal with data. I don't have funny stories like David. I don't have the vast professional experience of some of the other speakers. But what I'm going to try and do is explore with you the fundamental importance of supreme audit institutions from a theoretical perspective, particularly through the ideas of trust, democracy and integrity in government. And I hope that might be useful to you, first of all, in complimenting you on your own self-importance to the democratic system, but also as providing a bit of a standard by which to assess your own performance as what we shall discuss as integrity institutions. The challenge to you is to hold me accountable, and for one of you, at least, to ask the first question of me instead of having to rely on poor George over here. So you're you're young accountability people of your generation. Come hold me accountable with some hard questions. Okay. So I want to start with this quotation. It's the only long quotation I have, and it's from a man called James Madison, who I'm sure many of you know was one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution. And here's a quotation from the Federalists, the sort of these kind of works of very practical political theory that went into informing how the United States Constitution was structured. And the quotation reads, "The aim of every constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers, men," so we can update that a little bit, "people who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of the society, and in the next place, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous, which they continue to hold their public trust. The elective mode of obtaining rulers is the characteristic policy of republican government. The means relied on in this form of government for preventing their degeneracy are numerous and various." So, in order to kind of unpack the theory of democracy, theory of virtue, and the role of audit institutions in that, I just want to be an academic here for a little bit and do some definitions. First of all, just to clarify, what do we mean by these words we use all the time? So first of all, in this quotation, there's a couple of senses of trust at play. The first is a sense of what we call trusteeship, which is to say that you hold a trust and that you therefore have a sort of set of fiduciary responsibilities in relation to some other actor who is vulnerable. So I think many of you wouldn't understand what a legal trust is, but it's actually been a very old concept, both in theory and in this country in law, that public officers are a public trust. So what do we mean by trust? Well, to trust is to rely upon another agent to fulfill their commitment. If I make a commitment to you, implicitly or explicitly, you trust me if you're willing to rely upon that, if you're willing to kind of build it into your planning in the future, and hence in some sense be vulnerable to me. And it's really important to separate that from what it means to be trustworthy. Because to be trustworthy is to be someone who is reliable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you do trust me. In fact, it might be quite rational for you not to trust me. One reason would be all the fake news. The fake news about me that means you don't know how trustworthy I am because there's a whole lot of intermediary noise. But another reason, actually, is that you've got plenty of information about me. You're vulnerable. Because to trust is like a bet. To To trust is to take on a risk. And the more comfortable you are in life, the easier it is for you to take on risks. The risks aren't that high. The more vulnerable you are, the more unlikely you are to trust. So I often do with big companies, and they say, no one trusts us. You know, we're so great on the inside. I'm saying, well, from the outside, you're really big and powerful. I wouldn't care how well your marketing department does. I still wouldn't trust you, right? Because power at some point is so big that it makes you too vulnerable to trust. You're not going to rely upon that actor. Okay, so that's my little academic piece there to begin. To rationally trust, therefore, is a combination of, is the bet worth it? Do you have enough data, given your vulnerability, to trust? So with that, let's unpack Madison's little theory of democracy here. The first is the idea that public office is a position of public trust, a fiduciary position. And that's one that, as I said, in this country is actually enshrined in law. I mean, you see cases on the basis of whether people have abused their public trust. The interesting thing here is, secondly, that the primary aim of any constitution, and Madison's making this, whether it's a democracy or not, is to see if you can ensure that those filling those positions are wise and virtuous. And then this leads to this really interesting claim, which is that the primary purpose of one system, the system of electoral politics, is to ensure the trustworthiness, the virtue of rulers, not representation. And that's really fascinating, because normally when we think about democracy, we think it's all about representing our interests, the will of the people. And there are lots of really problematic ways of explaining why democracy, how on earth democracy does that, right, if at all. I mean, just trying to work out how the up-down referendum over Brexit represents our will of the people is very controversial. What was the will of the people with respect to Brexit? Was it to leave at all costs or not? I don't know. But an interesting way of understanding what democracy is and its value, or putative value, without even having to think about representation or the will of the people, is to see it as fundamentally a form of anti-corruption. We're less interested in what the wise and virtuous do with their power. We're most interested that they are wise and virtuous when they do it. So this actually leads to a paradox, if you've been following closely. This is the type of thing philosophers really love, a paradox. So democracy requires active distrust in order to hold the government accountable. It's for the electoral politics, holding people accountable, that we therefore get the second claim. It leads government to be more trustworthy. If people are constantly under threat of being audited, being held accountable, then they're more likely to act in a way which is not problematic if they are audited. And there's a selection bias, you might hope, into public office. But then that leads us to think we have good reason to trust government, which means that we don't have good reason to distrust government, which would then mean that it would be untrustworthy. It's almost as if there's this kind of two contrasting faces of democracy. It's built on distrust, but that only gives us reason to trust, which then gives us reason not to distrust, which gives us reason not to trust. So, how can we rationally trust and distrust at the same time? And one way of understanding this is the idea of how we resolve this in practice is by what we might call strategic distrust. In our societies, we delegate our distrusting role in large part to specific organisations. And traditionally, that would just be civil society, the media, competition between the other three branches of government. But definitely over the last 150 years, what we have seen is the emergence of what we might broadly call fourth branch institutions. And these in particular are you guys, specialist audit institutions. It's a branch that also includes anti-corruption institutions, I think bureaus of statistics, ombudsmen, other actors who we, as it were, delegate this role of strategic distrust. And so here, I think, is the first takeaway I'd like to kind of come at you with, which is a kind of bit of a story of your own self-importance, which is you are almost the unheralded heroes of what it is to live in a legitimate democratic regime. Well, we always talk about the three branches of government, but actually it's essential, at least under these modern complex societies, that we have a fourth branch of government that is headed by a supreme audit institution like those that you are members of. So if we buy that argument, if we buy this idea of the way in which auditing institutions are essential, deeply theoretically essential to good government, and yet perhaps somewhat unheralded, and we say, well, their major task is to keep them virtuous, well, what on earth does that mean? What does it mean to keep the politicians? I mean, in Australia, we just say, keep the bastards honest, right? What does that mean here in polite England? Keep them virtuous. So, well, which virtue? I mean, there are lots of different virtues, but I think that the key virtue is a kind of meta virtue, which is integrity. Integrity is the virtue that we attribute to one another where we have the other virtues in balance. So it's a kind of public integrity that we're looking for in our public agents. But the interesting thing here is which them. So some things have really changed since Madison's time. And it's not just data science, right? Governments now we're largely ruled by institutions rather than individuals, even though where certain legal powers might reside nominally in individuals. That's only done in a certain sense conditionally upon them heading an organisation which they have responsibility for and informs the way in which they exercise those duties. So really, when we look at our governments today, they're populated less by individuals, or only by individuals we need to keep virtuous. There are also institutions we need to keep virtuous. So what does it mean for a public institution to have integrity? What does it mean to keep an institution virtuous? So at the school, I lead a program called the Building Integrity Program. And one of the things we've been trying to do is define what it means for an institution, as opposed merely to a public officer, to have integrity. And this is the definition that we've come up with. It's the robust disposition of a public institution to pursue its purpose efficiently, within the limits of legitimacy, consistent with its commitments. And within this, there are kind of four key principles. The first is that the organisation is purpose-driven. The institution must pursue a clear, shared purpose to the best of its capacities. It must do so efficiently. And this is essential in order to assure that an organisation remains coherent and consistent, but also praiseworthy. The second condition is a legitimacy condition, and this is perhaps the most conceptually difficult and the most difficult to put in practice, because legitimacy doesn't exactly mean the law. The law is our best attempt to put legitimacy into practice, but they're never necessarily the one thing or the other, because laws sometimes can be so bad that they are illegitimate, and sometimes the laws don't capture quite what legitimacy requires. And what is legitimacy? Well, legitimacy is not be ethical, be moral, be just. Those are things that we disagree about immensely. But if we premised, government action on those things, then we would never agree that government had the right to act at all. Basis of legitimacy is kind of the idea that says, I disagree with you immensely, but I agree that you have the right to do that. That's what it is to have legitimacy. And that's the fundamental norm that's built in to an institution to have integrity. Has it filled the substantive procedural conditions that mean that it can claim that right in relation to other actors? The third here is commitments. You can't possibly expect an institution to be trustworthy if it doesn't keep its commitments. And that's not merely commitments to its purpose, to be legitimate, but also to various stakeholders as it goes along the lines. Whether that be employees, whether it be collaborators, whether it be communities, whether it be contractors. And finally, there's robustness. Robustness is the quality that makes sure that an organisation can deliver on these other three things come hail, rain and shine. It is the idea that you don't just have integrity when things are going well, you have integrity which you can sustain in the hard times. And that's what robustness delivers. So the interesting thing about these elements of integrity is they have an empirical relationship with public trust. Now, as I said, public trust is determined by lots of different things, lots of noise in our political system, and that affects the way in which we are perceived or an institution is perceived. But there is, insofar as an institution can control anything about itself, whether it is trustworthy, they do tie to public trust. So, purpose-driven, we can see that performance is a key determinant of public trust. Legitimacy, what is interesting is that often process values are of greater determinant of public trust than performance for many public sector organisations. Often people have a much better sense of whether you've followed process values than really whether your performance has been particularly good or not. Commitments and robustness. Okay. So this might be our account of institutional integrity, but what does it mean for each of you as public officers and each of the other public officers in the public service to have integrity? And so if you follow this argument along, you actually get a really interesting idea of what it is for each individual to have public officer integrity. And it's no longer, well, it's just whatever the minimum standards are on the wall. It's no longer the rather vague instruction, be ethical, right? Be moral. What does that mean? It's a very specific instruction. It says, go out there and do the best you can in the course of your public duties to be a steward of the integrity of your institution as a whole. It's like being a part of a football team and asking the coach, well, what type of football player do you want me to be? What would be the best type of football player? And the coach saying, well, here is what I want the football team to do as a whole. And I want you to make the best contribution you can to that ideal. It's about seeing institutional integrity as, in some sense, a team sport. Okay, so what does this mean? And then coming back to you guys, coming back to Supreme Audit institutions. Well, I think it gives us a way of thinking about what it is at a kind of deep theoretical level Supreme Audit institutions should be trying to do, or at least playing a major role in achieving. And you might think that, at 40,000 feet, it does, your Supreme Audit institutions, and I know you would be all very, very different, but sort of my broad practices hit some of these key elements. Performance audits, probably they allow us, value for money audits, allow us to look at whether it's a kind of efficient, purpose-driven organisation that we're looking at. Legitimacy. Well, compliance audits tend to focus on the law, and as we said, the law isn't the whole of legitimacy, but it's a rough estimation. And finally, things like financial standards and systems auditing might be ways of looking and assessing robustness. So that might be the way in which we see Supreme Audit institutions interacting or trying to live up to an ideal of assessing institutional integrity. being the kind of guardians of that within a democratic system. But is this enough strategic distrust for democracy? We got there, we started with Madison, we realised that strategic distrust is vital, structurally vital for democracy. You are the guys primarily given that responsibility. Are you delivering enough? So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not an auditor. I'm not here to audit the auditors. But you might think that maybe there are some gaps, and this is just questions for you. Do we actually take trustworthiness seriously in our public institutions? It's one thing for them to live up to their stated purpose, to deliver on their outcomes, but if they actually filled up to their commitments in the process? Or have they really just used and abused other various stakeholders during that process in order to formally deliver the outcomes and on the purpose? Particularly vulnerable actors, vulnerable communities who might often feel that they've been promised things numerous times but don't feel that the government or the public institution delivers on them. Is that taken into account anywhere, whether it be by a Supreme Audit institution or by other fourth branch institutions? Legitimacy. Is merely meeting the minimal legal standards sufficient for legitimacy? Or is it really a sense in which people are seeing institutions as illegitimate because of particular norms and ways of interacting with them that was strictly legal is somehow undermining the right of government to push them around? Thirdly, often when we audit or the retro accountability is a focus on individuals. But if we shift this institutional focus, are we doing enough to look at the cultural and organisational health of organisations? Are we moving from merely looking at bad apples to, as it were, the quality of the barrels? And finally, I think this interacts with something that someone was saying earlier today. At least on this account, integrity is an ideal. Integrity is no longer just a minimum standard. It includes minimum standards, but just because you're doing things legally and you're not doing them corruptly doesn't mean you have integrity. Integrity is the kind of light on the hill. So that means we should not merely assess things from a kind of a minimum standards view. We should always perhaps have things like a performance assessments for integrity. Have you actually not merely met the minimum standards, but acted ethically to a great extent, to an extent that's worthy of praising, not merely shaming? So, in conclusion, the idea of my talk here was to kind of reach back and down into the deep roots of why we have the systems we have. And in fact, it's quite generalisable beyond democracy. Madison thought that electoral politics was just one way in which we could try to keep those who ruled virtuous. The old idea of having our rulers being virtuous is arguably the ideal of every system. But I said, if that's the goal and we live in current society, then we need strategic actors like yourselves, like your institutions, to take up that responsibility. But if that's true, that kind of sort of leaves us with one question. Often the refrain in these circles is about accountability. But we also have to hold accountability itself as a process accountable. Because accountability is a means, right? It's not the end. The end is virtuous actors. The end is institutional integrity. It's not accountability for accountability's sake. So my final kind of suggestion or word is to think about how does your accountability measures interact with those who you're trying to take accountable? Does it actually lead them to act in ways that may well fit your requirements, but actually ultimately undermines their institutional integrity as a whole? Okay, thank you very much.